Hello everyone, my name is Eleonora Tafur-Ambrosetti. I'm a research fellow at ISPI Center for Russia, Caucasus and Central Asia. Welcome to this event on the war against Ukraine. The past few weeks have been particularly intense when it comes to Russia's war against Ukraine. We saw important military gains made by Ukraine through its counteroffensive. On 21 September, Russia announced a partial mobilization of up to 300,000 reservists in partial response to military setbacks. We also saw the announcement and carrying out of referendums in 4 Ukrainian regions, which are only partially militarily occupied by Russia, Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia and Kherson. Today these regions are annexed by the Kremlin, so we saw also the widespread international condemnation of this latest annexation by Russia. We also saw a, let's say, deterioration of the political rhetoric by Russia and the threat of the use of nuclear weapons. To discuss these important developments and what impact they will have on the current and future situation in and around Ukraine, I'm joined today by 4 excellent speakers. Let me introduce them to you. Andrei Kolesnikov is a senior research fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Used to be Carnegie Russia, that was shut down in the past few months. In I don't remember when exactly, in March, I guess. He's especially focusing on Russian domestic politics and trends in ideological shifts inside the Russian society. Olga Oliker is Crisis Group's program director for Europe and Central Asia, focusing on Russian and Ukrainian foreign and security policies and the post-Soviet region and the US policies and strategies towards this region. She's also an expert on nuclear weapon strategy and arms control, so very useful expertise today. Ben Aris is the editor-in-chief at Business New Europe, is an Eastern Europe specialist, having lived and worked in Moscow for over 10 years until 2003, where he was bureau chief for the Daily Telegraph, as well as a contributor to other news outlets. Today he's based in Berlin, but he still focuses on Russia. Then we have Francesco Giumelli, Associate Professor in International Relations at the Groningen University in the Netherlands. His area of expertise are international sanctions and illicit trade. Indeed, he coordinates the illicit trade group at the University of Groningen. Welcome, everyone. I'll start with Olga, because I'd like to ask you for a general assessment of the situation on the ground. You were recently in Ukraine, in Dnipro, and maybe other cities as well. So I'd like you to tell us a little bit about the military situation, but also the morale, the mood in Ukraine.
Thank you. Thank you, Lenora. Thanks to ISPI for convening us all. So I was in Kiev and I was in Dnipro, and I also was in a car driving across a lot of Ukraine about a week and a half ago. Flights are still not flying in and out. So car and train are kind of your options for getting around. What we've seen since late August, when Ukraine actually began this counteroffensive that had been promised for so long, but people were starting to wonder if it would happen, is that Ukraine actually made some really rapid movement, especially in the northeast, retaking most of Kharkiv region, where Russia had made real inroads previously. It also made some progress early in September in the south, but that stalled out. Russian forces were better prepared and better dug in there. Now we're seeing real progress being made in Kherson in the south as well. So we're seeing a really substantial Ukrainian push forward, which, as Eleonora said, seems to be what has driven Russia to raise the stakes, both mobilizing or announcing the mobilization of large numbers of almost entirely men. We've heard of some women getting mobilization notices, and also saying that it had annexed territory, although it appears unclear to Moscow itself just what territory it has or has not annexed. It certainly does not control all of the regions in question. Talking to the Ukrainians a week and a half ago, so at the time when the annexation votes, so-called votes, had been announced, but prior to Putin's speech, and when the mobilization had been announced, what we were hearing was, on the one hand, the Ukrainians were very pleased with themselves. They also were kind of torn between assessing the Russian military as having failed very badly, but also being careful not to discount the mobilization entirely, right? On the one hand, difficult to imagine how Russia would train and equip these people, given the difficulty it had training, equipping, and deploying people over the 7 months prior. But at the same time, not wanting to say that this wasn't an issue at all. So waiting and seeing, but certainly not deterred by nuclear threats, past or present. The comment one Ukrainian made to me, paraphrasing comment from Vladimir Putin some years back, clearly is not all it's been cracked up to be, and the Ukrainians are pretty good. Some concern about continuing Western support, but also just a very very strong will to continue to stay the course. I think, if anything, the annexation announcements only strengthen that backbone, and probably also, I think, have a tendency to strengthen European support as well.
Thank you. And Andrei, I'd like to go to Moscow to ask what is the mood in Russia after the mobilization and the results of the Ukrainian counteroffensive. We saw quite a vivid debate on Russian media on the, let's say, falls and setbacks, both in military terms, but also in terms of the chaotic mobilization, the fact that mistakes have been made, causing protests as well. So what is the mood in Russia at the moment?
Thank you so much for the invitation. It's a very good question, maybe the main one. The mood is bad. The mood is nervous, and 69% of the population is anxious. It's even according to the pro-Kremlin pollster FOM. Moreover, the anxiety has grown with lightning speed from 35% to 69%, observed as early as September 15, a few days before the mobilization. So a jump of 34%. This is a price of Putin's taking the population out of their comfort zone, where Kremlin and professionals are in charge of the war effort, while the rest of the citizens are simply approve it, staring at the TV, watching the victories and Kremlin talk shows, I name it couch troops. But now, after the mobilization and the annexation of 4 Ukrainian territories, everything has been changed and people are out of their comfort zone. The escalation is obvious, and there is no joy from the territorial expansion. In 2014, if we compare it, there was general euphoria, but now this effort cannot be achieved even with artificially assembled Putins, so-called Putins, the mixture of towards Putin and meetings. And no thoughts, just emotions among the majority of Russians. It is visible. For instance, during focus groups, a colleague of mine, Denis Volkov, who is the director of Levada Center, convened focus groups in the Russian provinces. And he says that people can't assess properly what is happening. They have so much emotions. According to polls, not to focus groups, to polls of Levada Center, mobilization has caused anxiety, fear, and horror. This is half of the population. And 30% more, these people feel shock. And these feelings are most clearly expressed by younger age cohorts. The pride for Russia, nevertheless, was experienced by a quarter of respondents, but mostly at the expense of older groups. In cohorts from 18 years old to 24 years old, the figure is only 9%. A very interesting group of people is 40-year-olds, which are able to feel both horror and pride at the same time. Maybe this is more or less typical for the current situation. But I must say that this is a violation of old-fashioned, let's say, unwritten social contract between Putin and the population. We voters, we do not intervene into your problems, into your stealing money, corruption, and fighting wars. But you don't touch us. You don't intervene into our private life. Right now, the authorities touched private lives of millions of people. And we see how people were reacting. I mean, they're fleeing the country. New figures are appearing, and I would say that they're very impressive. We can't say that these figures are true, but today I've seen figures 700,000 of people who fled Russia in recent days. So it demonstrates discontent, for sure, despite the fact that there are a lot of supporters of war, supporters of Putin, people who are ready to fight, volunteers in military commissariats, etc., etc. But for normal people, this is a hard shot. This is an emotional problem when they lose their normal life, their working places, the environment, everything. It was not in this social contract. Kind of wars, because they lived for many years in a society which was really modernized. Maybe state wasn't so modernized, but society looked like. In that, the confidence, the trust, approval of Putin's regime could be undermined. I can't predict to what extent, because the contraction of approval in September, in the first day after mobilization, was only 6%. But this is meaningful in the situation when these figures were very stable for a long time, since from April, I would say. Really, this is a serious problem, just like it was in time of pension reform, retirement age reform, and in time of pandemic, when Putin intervened into private life of people. This is not a political problem, but people answer it in a political way. The ratings of Putin, the ratings of governmental bodies were falling down. So here we are, and here is one more specific moment, the threat of nuclear war, which is visible because top politicians are talking about it. Medvedev was talking about it, Putin, Peskov, etc., and for sure Kadyrov. And we don't have any kind of special surveys on this topic, but in May there was a question to respondents whether they are obsessed or whether they feel anxiety concerning possible use of nuclear war by Putin. And 50% said that yes, they are afraid of it. It means that they believe in the possibility of this kind of use of nukes. Not to mention that for several years, from 2018, in the list of anxieties, in the list of fears of the population, the fear of the world war is on the second place after the illnesses of loved ones. It's also serious. People do not want any kind of this war. I understand that this anticipatory obedience is very high in the Russian society, and maybe discontent is not too impressive for Putin, but nevertheless, he will have problems with the population attitudes toward him. And he will have problems with economy for sure, because partial mobilization is very painful for the economy, for the labor market, for high technology places in this labor market, even for a so-called parallel import, which is so important for consumption, for contribution of food in Russia. And in that sense, it's again a very painful story for Putin. How he will react to all that stuff, nobody knows. We can seriously discuss the possibility of using nukes.
That would be my second question to you. We're going to talk about it in a short while, Andrei, but thank you for painting a very detailed picture of what is a really complex situation. I'd like to turn to the Western responses to, and especially European responses to the war, because we saw a consistent military support to Ukraine, but we also saw like 7 packages of sanctions so far imposed by the EU to Russia. So I would like to focus on this, because in Italy, you see, it's a very hot topic at the moment. We have an increasingly bad economic situation driven by the rise in energy prices, and so there are more and more talks about the effectiveness of sanctions. So my question for Francesco and Ben is about the sanctions effectiveness. Maybe Francesco, you could focus also on the effects of sanctions on the European countries that imposed those sanctions, and Ben, you could maybe focus more on the Russian economy and how it has been affected by sanctions. Maybe you can start, Ben, with the Russian economy.
Sure. So the way I view this is that after the Ukraine was invaded in the end of February, what happened was the European Union in particular, but the West in general, responded with an extreme package of sanctions. And normally sanctions are diplomatic tools designed to pressure a government into doing something or undoing something that you don't like. However, these sanctions, from the beginning, von der Leyen made it very clear, these sanctions were designed to degrade the Russian economy. It was an attack. These are not normal diplomatic sanctions. These are economic weapons. And so they were the most extreme. Going into as the tensions were rising, things like cutting Russia off from the SWIFT banking sector was mentioned as a nuclear option. The freezing of the central bank's reserves was not even mentioned. That came out of totally left field. So Russia was hit by these really, really painful sanctions and nearly caused a financial crisis. However, against all of that, Putin's been building this financial fortress for the last 10 years. I mean, Russia's been growing so slowly for the last decade because he was diverting all the spare money into this huge war chest, this fund that they had. And at the same time, investing into domestic agriculture, trying to, import substitute, trying to get rid of all the inputs that Russia has. And the economy has responded remarkably well. I mean, it's still been hurt. We're looking at something like 4% contraction this year. However, when this started, people were predicting 8 to 15%. Some people were saying 30%. Some people were expecting a full financial meltdown, and that didn't happen. And you have to admit that the Bulina at the central bank, is a veteran of multiple crises. She knows what to do, and she acted very fast, very resolute, and took control of the situation. And now Russia's left to, struggle on. I mean, there's been the attacks on the oil, but the oil and gas, but that's backfired in the sense that the idea was to reduce the revenue flow to the Kremlin from those exports. And what's happened is the prices have been pushed up tenfold. And any reduction in volume has been more than compensated by the amount of money that Russia has earned from the higher prices. And it's currently earning more money than it's ever earned before. So in the sense that those sanctions were trying to take away the revenue from the Kremlin, those ones have failed. However, come December, there's a new set of sanctions, an oil ban that might be put in place, an oil price cap that might be put in place. But if you ask my opinion, those things are going to be very, very difficult to make work. However, much more painful has been the ban on technology and particularly equipment imports, microchips, these sort of things. And this is the one area where the West completely controls back. The oil hasn't worked because China and India basically have been buying Russian oil, and so there's significant leakage. But the equipment and microelectronics come largely from Germany, from the States, from Taiwan, and those are very effectively being cut off. And that, in the long term, affects Russia's productivity. It cannot do without them. And Bulina said in March, as soon as this war started, she warned Russian businessmen that you're going to have to trade down at least 2 generations of productivity. And Russia's economy was growing slowly before, but now we're talking about maximum growth of 1%, 1.5%. And that's stagnation. That's long-term stagnation for the Russian economy. However, the problem with the sanctions is all the sanctions that we've been putting in, they will work, they're devastating, but they only work in the long term. And in the meantime, we have this war, and Putin's counter-response, because we're in an economic war now, and he controls commodities, he controls energy prices, he controls wheat prices, he controls metal prices. And his response is to fight back by pushing all those prices up to extraordinary levels. And we're seeing that in Europe. We've got super high inflation, which is driven 76% by food commodities and energy prices. And we've got super high energy bills, which is causing a crisis this winter. And the West so far has responded by subsidies and price caps, but they've spent €500 billion already, and that will probably double by next year. And it's now going to hit the consumers because it's going to transfer into energy prices just as the winter starts. And there's even a question as to whether there'll be enough gas to get through the winter. Some are predicting a cold winter. That would be very bad news. And then we could see extreme things like rationing, blackouts. It remains to be seen how bad it will be. But then it will carry on next year because it will become extremely difficult to refill the gas tank. So I think everyone's in the process now of playing catch-up, trying to understand the impact on the West of Russia's response and just where it has how much control over these commodities, where it can ratchet up the prices, where it can cut things off and cause food prices, energy prices, power prices, inflation prices, which are all going to impact us and then have political consequences. Like you say, in Italy, the conversation started, same in Berlin. the conversation started about, can I afford this? Where's the money going to come from? And it's going to be difficult. I don't see this whole this economic war with Russia being over in the short time. And in the meantime, the Russian economy is functioning fine. I mean, it's used up all of its budget surplus that it had at the start of the war. It's down to nothing. It'll probably end the year with a 2% deficit. But at the moment, there's money in the Treasury account, there's money in the National Welfare account, the Welfare Fund account, and it has the ability to borrow from the domestic market, so it can cover a 2% pretty easily. And it could probably cover the same sort of deficit next year, again, fairly easily. But it won't be able to keep that up forever. But it buys Putin a sort of 2-year window in order to bring this war to a conclusion. And at the moment, I think that's what he's going for. And the conscription, the call-up has just been the mobilization, is designed, I think his thinking is to try and bring a definitive end, whatever that means to him, by next year sometime, because beyond that, Russia's economy starts to have serious problems.
Francesco, what's your take on this? And lots of different dimensions of this problem have been raised by Ben already, like the sustainability for EU economies as well, the price cap. What do you think about all this?
Thank you very much, first of all, for the invitation. This is a very interesting discussion, and thanks also, Ben, for talking to give me a lot of things to discuss and talk about sanctions. Before I go into details, what I would like to say is that there is a lot of discussion about sanctions and whether it was a good idea to use sanctions. At some point in some of the European countries, we also had a discussion on should we lift sanctions even in the middle of the war. But I would like to say the sanctions are working. So sanctions are doing what they're supposed to be doing, what they're designed to do. It's very misplaced to think that sanctions can cripple economies and bring states to a collapse. It didn't happen with Iraq in the 90s, and that was way more serious sanctions than today. It didn't happen with Iran. It didn't happen with North Korea. And even the sanctions in North Korea are arguably even stronger than the ones, or harsher than the one that we have on Russia. So the idea of seeing Russia collapsing was never in the design of sanctions. It is true that these kind of sanctions designed against Russia are beyond what we normally would have done 10 years ago or 5 years ago. The idea of sanctions going so beyond the elite and the decision makers, so beyond certain sectors, then certainly was a little bit forgotten at the beginning of the invasion, also because the signal that we had to send was an important one, a strong one. A country invading another country, especially in Europe, was unseen in a long time. So sanctions served that purpose. So we needed to give a strong response. Now, how is this strong response working out? Well, then we have seen, Ben has mentioned a number of things, especially, again, not the collapse of the economy, because if you look at the macro data, the economy in itself is not really a very good indicator to know whether sanctions are working or not. What you should look at is the kind of technology, this kind of capacities that then the state is able to produce. You have a very slow drop in GDP, but which kind of productions do you have now in Russia that you could have had without sanctions? This is the real added value. And then, of course, there is a cumulative effect over time. These things will only get worse over time, unless there are a number of things we have to say, unless Russia is able to either adjust, so develop those technologies that they cannot import otherwise, or make sure that they manage to buy this from somewhere else. And this is something I also will mention in a second. But overall, sanctions are designed to prevent Russia from making decisions and choices that they would have made otherwise. For instance, to replenish the weapons, to replenish the army with new weapons, that now it is not being the case. We have seen Russia going to buy ammunition from North Korea, from Iran. Certainly, some of the military equipment that comes from these countries, especially the drones from Iran, have been more effective than thought. Yet they are going only to these producers to buy ammunition, and certainly they are less effective than could have been otherwise. We've seen now also the military operations being severely undermined by the fact that certain equipment is not there anymore. The idea of going to war and taking over Kiev in 3 days, of course, didn't work out, and therefore also the whole equipment and the reserves, the ammunitions that they had a limitation in the utilization, in the possibility of development, and sanctions are very effective in that sector. But having said that, of course, sanctions have a cost. This is undeniable. This is one of the things I would like to build also on what Ben said. We've been going to war with an economy of peace. That's exactly the language he uses. At least in Russia, the government is controlling that, and that. While in the European Union, we haven't done any of these. We have been trying to go to war with an economy of peace, which means that, for instance, the gas price and the way in which we determine the price of energy has not changed a bit since the beginning of the war, which means, of course, that in an exceptional situation, the price of gas is not only dependent on the fact that there is less availability, and for that sanctions had certainly an impact, but it was not the only thing. But the way in which we determine the price of gas made the difference. The way in which we used and organized the infrastructure of energy in the European Union made a difference. And of course, by using and not changing those rules, the price of gas and the price of electricity goes up. This is inevitable, but this is not only connected to sanctions, but it's connected to at least two things. First, the lowering of the availability, the increasing or the very inelastic dependency on energy, on gas, that the European Union has, because that's also part of the story. Gas is important as long as you need it. It's not that the price of energy or gas in itself is so important that it's the only way in which we can produce energy. There are certain lines of productions that are dependent on gas, not all production lines that are dependent on gas. So again, all these kind of discussions we could have done and managed them at the European Union level, and we haven't done that yet. And then I will say the last point. Indeed, we need to think about the time constraint. So sanctions will work over time. And then, as I said, there is a time adjustment capacity from the Russian side. There is the alternative sources discussion that we need to somehow bring into the table, which is part of the aid package of the European Union. And the question is, can we ban those technologies that no one else can sell them? Because if we just ban a technology that they can buy simply somewhere else, then the ban is less effective. We need to identify those technologies that they cannot buy anywhere else, but we also need to talk to the allies and other partners and to make sure that they cooperate. Because if they don't cooperate, then the problem is still there, and they will be able to have these technologies. And the last thing, the Russian Federation can adjust, but also the European Union can and should adjust over time. So one of the things that Ben was saying, for instance, is that we have some gas for this winter, but we have to see for the following winter. Well, if by next year, and then that's the last thing I will say, if by the next winter we still need so much gas, it means that the European Union has made a lot of mistakes and we wasted 1 year instead of developing and preparing the infrastructure 18 months down the line from a war that we saw coming, and then now we know very clearly what the consequences are.
This is a key point also in light of the European strategy of reduction of demand of fossil fuels, the decarbonization of the economies. So, I mean, of course, the two discourses are interlinked. Olga, Francesco was talking about Russia buying weapons and ammunition from other countries, but Russia does have a very important nuclear capacity, and indeed it has been threatening the West with the use of nuclear weapons. How serious should we take this threat? I mean, do you think it's likely first that Russia is going to use it? And if it used it, what would be the Western response to it?
So I think what Russia has been doing is using nuclear weapons the way they're usually used, which is coercively as threats. Right? Nuclear weapons exist, for the most part, not to be used. They exist to deter, and sometimes to try to compel adversaries that if you don't do what I don't want you to do, if you stop doing what I want you to stop doing, you won't face a nuclear weapon. If you keep doing the thing I don't want you to do, if you do something I don't want you to do, you risk my nuclear weapon use. Now, traditionally, what that does is it's a standoff of the other side's nuclear weapon use, right? I won't use a nuclear weapon against you. You won't use one against me, because if one of us does, you get a nuclear war and it blows up the world. That's the U.S. Soviet and later U.S. Russia standoff. What we're seeing Russia try to do now, and what we've seen since the start of the war, since the start of the full-scale war since February, is Russia trying to deter Ukraine from continuing to fight and deter and stop Western countries from supporting Ukraine by suggesting that they risk escalation to Russian nuclear use. And initially, it was this comment that anybody who gets in our way will face consequences such as they have never imagined. More recently, what we're hearing is, Russia's territorial integrity is sacrosanct, and Russia will use all tools at its disposal to protect it. And then, kind of later comments about nuclear use, and most recently about the United States having set a precedent for nuclear use with the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki at the end of World War II. So put all that together, and it seems to be suggesting that Russia might use nuclear weapons in one way, shape, or form if Ukraine continues to fight for the territory that Russia has now claimed as Russia. Now, the problem with these threats is whether or not they're credible, right? Ukraine has already attacked both territory Russia claims as annexed in Crimea and territory on Russia itself. Also, Ukraine continues to fight on the territory that Russia may or may not have annexed, right? There's some muddiness about exactly what Russia claims and it doesn't claim. We know that nuclear deterrence holds because Russia has up until now not struck NATO member states, even the ones that are supplying aid, even the ones that are training Ukrainians. It has kept its military strikes to Ukraine. I'm not sure what happened with the Nord Stream pipeline, but everybody says they don't know. And Western states have also tried to avoid escalation by avoiding direct involvement in a war with Russia, right? So everybody thinks it's credible that if there's a direct war between NATO member states and Russia, you risk escalation. So everybody has tried to avoid that. What Moscow is doing is trying to suggest that there's something short of that could cause that war, and therefore Western countries should back down. Thus far, the response has been that that's not credible, that they don't believe it. Should they? Well, couldn't tell you, right? We have this problem that the final decision is made very likely by one individual human being who may or may not be driven by his doctrine and things he said in the past, right? If you look at the doctrine, if you look at things Russia has said in the past, then the bar for nuclear weapon use by Russia is a threat to the existence of the state, which you might consider to include a threat to the government staying the way it is, but we're way short of that still. So my assessment is that you have to take these threats seriously, but I'm not expecting nuclear weapon use tomorrow. I'd also kind of underline that we're talking about coercive threats. We're not talking about something where there's a battlefield logic that you use a nuclear weapon to attain a military goal that you couldn't otherwise attain, right? Yes, if you use a nuclear weapon on a bridge, that bridge is probably going to be gone. But you can use conventional weapons to destroy that bridge too, and they won't have the fallout, both the actual literal fallout and the radiation, the blast effects, nor will they have the political effects. So there's not a military logic to using nuclear weapons. Right, if you're seeing nuclear weapon use, it probably means that Russia has decided that the alternative is its collapse one way or another, and it is, to kind of put it colloquially, going for broke. Again, I don't think we're there yet, but I do think it's something that we have to take seriously.
Better safe than sorry, right? in this regard, like if Russia used nuclear weapons, I guess European sanctions wouldn't be enough as a response. But still, I'd like to ask Francesco, what exactly does the 8th package of sanctions entail? You spoke earlier about technologies that Russia cannot get anywhere else. So what types of technology you're talking about, and what role could China play in becoming a technological provider to Russia? In a way, it's already providing Russia with semiconductors, but not to an extent that it replaces the Western providers.
Yes, this is a very important question. The first thing that I want to say is that the 8th package is not designed to counter any any nuclear threat. At the moment, the nuclear discussion is real. It is especially real when it comes to the possibility for the Russian Federation to use that either for demonstrative purposes or nuclear test is also a possibility, rather than using actually this kind of military technology on the field. And indeed, as you said, Eleonora, if there is an utilization of nuclear weapons, I don't think that sanctions, whatever sanctions you design, would be an appropriate response or an appropriate way in which you manage that threat. So as of now, we're not talking about that. So as of now, the 8th package comes after the annexation of the 4 regions in Ukraine, and that is basically going also in a direction that should have gone anyway. So basically, there are 3 components. We are still at the statement phase, so we don't know exactly what this contains. So now we have the Council, and the Council agreed on a certain number of sanctions. What does this mean? First, there is the idea of going after certain individuals that are also, and that is something very important, this is something also very new for the European Union, that are facilitating the circumvention of sanctions. This is not only going to target the responsible people for certain actions, but going to the friends or to the allies or the companies or the actors that are actually helping for that. This is very new for the European Union. This is normally not done. We tend to go after only the wrongdoers, but not after those who facilitate the wrongdoers. So that would be the first.
Is it sort of like a secondary sanction in a way?
That's an important question. It depends how they write this down. If the secondary sanctions is one of these measures imposed by the United States on third-party nationals, so that would be on non-EU citizens here and there. In our case, we don't know yet. If I have to bet, according to what the European Union has been doing, they would be on EU actors based. Or EU actors, linked to EU actors. I don't think that we are at that stage where the European Union will go after third-party nationals, unless there are, blatant schemes done on purpose, precisely to do that. But that would be really aligning with the US on something that we've been disagreeing for a long time. So this is still, for what I could see, this is still not clear. If I would see this, then I would be a bit surprised, not entirely surprised, but I think it's too soon for that. So not secondary sanctions, but only sanctions on circumventions of EU measures. So the second part then of measures would be then going after specific technologies, as I was saying before. Exactly what this technology in the defense and the military is more difficult to detect at the moment, because what happens normally is that the Council issues the statement of intent, and then there is a negotiation within the Council and the working groups exactly to identify these technologies. But I can very well guess that there are specific products that are used, for instance, for, the semiconductor that are normally used for military technology or military equipment, radar, and these kind of measures, these kind of machines. And then the last part that is basically not the minor part is the price cap. The price cap is borderline with the sanctions, because something like this we haven't seen, so we can't really say it's a normal sanction, but it's really more of a strategic decision. The price cap imposed only by the European Union is likely to fail and create huge inequalities within the EU market. What you need to do, you need to agree with others. And that's when you can really have an impact on the price of energy and the price of gas. If a lot of actors are brought under this, the G7 agreed to this. Now we need to see whether we're going to be able to compromise also with other actors outside. And then last but not least, and then I know that we are short in time, so we'll not talk much. The aid package is an announcement, but for the voting, we need to see how it goes, because it needs to be voted by the 27 members. It's still a unanimous voting. There are some of the members that are more preoccupied than others with some of the measures that are within the aid package, especially the price cap. So we need to see eventually what actually ends up in the final decision that is being made by the European Union.
Thank you so much, Francesco. Ben, we know that the many economies in the post-Soviet regions are highly linked or even dependent on the Russian economy. So my question is, what's the reaction, like in what concerns the problems or future problems that the economic stagnation in Russia will have in terms of remittances, in terms of trade agreements? Do you have any ideas on this?
Yeah, I mean, Russia's always been a node for the whole of the Eurasia region, and so the countries in Central Asia, for example, are very dependent. And also there's ones on the eastern border of the European Union are also tied. Hungary is being reluctant to toe the line because it's so dependent on Russian oil and gas, which are piped directly to it. And Serbia, the same story. And Turkey has taken a position whereby it wants to be sit on the fence, and it sees geopolitical and economic advantages not taking sides. Whereas the Central Asian countries, they've taken a very pragmatic view, where politically they've distanced themselves from Putin. Tokayev, the Kazakh president, to Putin's face on the stage in St. Petersburg, said, "I do not recognize Lugansk as independence," which was a slap in the face. But at the same time, they remain major trading partners, and they're very dependent. Countries like Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, the remittances are significant shares of their GDP. And those migrant workers have all gone back to Russia now. And it's become even more profitable for them since the ruble has appreciated so strongly, because they send their money back in dollars. So I think they're tied to it. I mean, going beyond, I mean, Francesco was talking about the oil price cap, and the G7 finance ministers signed off on that. But if you look to the global south, to Africa, to Middle East, and then beyond down to Southeast Asia, Russia has a lot of friends there who are very interested in the commodities, in the oil, the gas, the wheat, but also in the arms that Russia can provide. That's particularly true in Africa. And those economies are all set to benefit, I think, in the sense that they're going to get a lot more attention from Russia, a lot more in the way of money, nuclear power stations. I mean, there's whatever 14 projects now on the go in Africa being discussed, and 4 of them are actually going ahead. And the Americans are likely to come and do the same thing. They just set up a $600 billion infrastructure fund to target these markets. And so I think for a lot of these developing or even frontier markets, they're set to benefit from this because of all the attention they're going to get. But long term, the bet Putin has is that he can ignore the West, do without the technology that the West has, and build a new life in the global south, the emerging markets, down through Southeast Asia, Central Asia, and on into Latin America. And to what extent, because those are the countries that have the growth. They're the EM world, the emerging market world, is now bigger GDP-wise than the developed world. And to what extent is that true? I don't know. I mean, this story, I think, is what's going to keep us occupied for the next decade, seeing how it plays out.
Thank you. And now I have one last question for Andrei, possibly the most difficult one. What do you think are Putin's options at the moment? I mean, do you have possible future scenarios for the Russian leadership's behavior?
Yeah, it's a hard question, because we have to be inside the brains of in the brains of Putin, and it's quite difficult even for his inner circle, even for his friends, cronies, etc. I think in the case if he wants to stop the war, he can do it right now, not paying too much attention to possible people's reaction. People are tired of war, and they're ready for peace. They're ready for continuation of war only in terms of full victory over Ukrainians, and because of that, folks wants much more energetic efforts in the battlefield. But at the same time, even people who are supporting Putin, they want to stop this war. It has been prolonged. It is procrastinated for a long time, and people feel problems in their private life, despite the fact that officially and visually, let's say, especially in summer, the economy looked quite good. But we feel something in the air. Let's say that here is a serious contraction in everything, in the markets, in the labor market, etc., etc. So it could be really serious. And the best way, the best exit for Putin is to achieve peace. People will accept it. His ratings do not so dependent on bellicose actions of his army and his Siloviki bodies. I think that for the majority of Russians, the peace is acceptable. They will not accuse Putin in peace, let's say. But here is the logic of, let's say, atmospheric phenomena, political phenomena among average Russians. But I would say that here is another logic, the logic of Putin himself. This is really the only person who can make decisions in these circumstances. He couldn't be stopped even by elites, even by his milieu, his closest cronies. They feel themselves just like in a submarine, blocked with him, sanctioned by the West. A lot of distrust to each other. They can't organize, orchestrate conspiracy against Putin. So the best way for them to be mute and to be with him. This is a problem. They can't stop him. And because of that, I think that he will go his own way. And it means the continuation of war. Alice. To what extent? Where is the final point of it? Whether he will use a nuclear weapon or will not use. In that sense, he doesn't pay too much attention to public sentiments. He simply does not pay attention to problems in the economic sphere. He had 2 meetings with Alexei Kudrin in the first stage of war in spring and in the beginning of summer. But even with his old friend Kudrin, he repeats, just like a robot, the same words. The goals of the operation must be achieved. So it means that the world is in danger in that sense. So it's not too optimistic, but I really can't see any signs of readiness for peace. Convening referendums, Putin understood that he's blocking any possibility for negotiations with Ukraine. But he did it. It means that he doesn't want peace right now, at least. So I'm not ready to say what kind of discontent, what kind of socioeconomic problems can stop him. Maybe we shall see it in the future, but right now I'm afraid that we are somewhere in the middle of this procrastinated war.
Well, thank you for this bleak but frank assessment. We have just a couple of minutes left and several questions from the audience. I'll just ask just one question to Olga, because most of the questions are related to the performance of the Russian army after mobilization and the possibility of Ukraine to win this war through the counteroffensive with the support of the West. For instance, Bruno asks what was the balance in numbers between Ukrainian soldiers and Russian soldiers before and now, simply, how can Ukraine win this war? A very simple question. There you go, in 3 minutes.
Okay, balance of forces, much easier. So the Russians went into Ukraine with just under 200,000 people. The Ukrainian armed forces, kind of the statutory size, was about 250K at that time, but that included lots of support. The Ukrainian armed forces have probably doubled to tripled, not quite. There's probably about 600 to 700,000 people under arms in Ukraine right now, 50,000 of whom are women, incidentally. The Russian armed forces as a whole, the number that people assumed was something like 800K. It's not clear to me what the actual numbers are these days. And this also speaks to, if you have an 800,000 strong force and you can only muster under 200K to invade your neighbor, and if that force then becomes depleted, you have to mount a huge mobilization, something very strange is going on with your numbers. Russia is having a hard time has been having a hard time getting people to fill its ranks, hence the mobilization. Now it's going to have a hard time, even if it get the people mustered, getting them equipped and trained. It doesn't seem to be planning to do all that much to those ends. This is what leads lots of folks, myself included, to wonder what exactly it's planning to do with these people. Ukraine has lots of people willing to serve. It also has a training pipeline, that equipping pipeline, that's a little slower than that, but it's not running out of volunteers to keep serving. How does Ukraine win? Well, Ukraine honestly wins if Russia decides to do what Andrei said, which is recognize that peace is its best option. Absent that, look, Ukraine is doing quite well right now, but you're still looking at small movements along a pretty big front line. And that still doesn't even start to ask the question of what happens if Ukraine reaches the February 24 lines and tries to move into territory that Russia has held for 8 years, which is better reinforced and better defended, and the question of Crimea. So, we've had really substantial Ukrainian success in recent weeks, but this war is not over. And I think a lot of the question of victory depends on how you define victory, right? You can hear people say that Ukraine has already won, quite simply because, Ukraine is still there. Ukraine is still sovereign. You will hear people also say that Ukraine will not have won until Russia is dismembered. The reality of what victory could mean is probably somewhere in between. But it's, this has been a war of many surprises just in the 7 months plus that it has gone on. I'm expecting more surprises. I'm hoping that those surprises will not include anything too catastrophic for all of us. But I'm very hesitant to predict the future.
Fingers crossed. So I'm sorry for the other questions that we don't have time to address at the moment. Those questions were mostly on energy issues and economic issues. So I invite everyone to follow the second event in this cycle, which will focus on energy and environmental consequences of the war. It will be on the 11th of October at the same time at 4 p.m. Let me thank you. Thank you so much, all the speakers, Olga Oliker, Ben Ares, Andrei Kolesnikov, and Francesco Giumelli for sharing their insights with us. Thank you very much, everyone at home that followed this event, and I hope to see you on the 11th as well.